Welcome to Old Hollywood Story. Here we peel back the golden curtain to reveal the shadows lurking behind the world's greatest legends. Today, we begin our final journey into the life of a woman who was both a goddess and a victim of her own beauty, Brigitte Bardot. On December 28, 2025, the world stood still. In the silence of her villa in Saint-Tropez, the last icon of the century passed away. But to understand her end, we must return to the very beginning, to the place where a little girl from a strict family transformed into the most beautiful sin of France. Paris, 1934. In the fashionable 15th arrondissement, at house number 5 on Rue Pascal, Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot was born. Her childhood was not filled with love. It was a golden cage. Her father, Louis Bardot, nicknamed Pilou, was a successful businessman, but at home he ruled like a tyrant. Brigitte and her sister Mijanou were raised like porcelain dolls, perfect manners, ballet, and absolute obedience. Few know, but as a child, Brigitte considered herself ugly. She had a squint and braces. She grew up in her sister's shadow, hiding behind thick-lensed glasses. Once, when the sisters broke a Chinese vase, their father whipped them with a lash 20 strokes. It was then that Brigitte stopped calling her parents Mom and Dad. Brigitte's reaction to her parents' ban was desperate. At just 15, she was ready to risk everything, even her own life, just to be with Vadim. After she was narrowly saved following a highly dangerous incident at home, her terrified parents realized she wasn't joking. It was her first, but far from her last, step toward the abyss. Her parents surrendered. The marriage was allowed, but only when she turned 18. For 3 years, Vadim sculpted his ideal from her. He taught her how to walk, how to let her hair down, and how to be free from morality. The dirty truth is that Vadim saw her as a commodity. He was her Pygmalion, but he also became the first dealer to put her nakedness up for sale. 1956, the film And God Created Woman. Vadim forced her to film almost naked, covered only by a bedsheet. The Vatican cursed the film, calling Bardot the incarnation of the devil. In the US, it was banned for excessive sensuality. While Vadim traded her image, betrayal was brewing on set. Brigitte fell in love with Jean-Louis Trintignant. Vadim himself created the atmosphere of vice in which his wife found another. Thus, a legend was born. But behind this freedom lurked a hell that was only just beginning. Fame didn't come to Brigitte gradually. It crashed over her like a tsunami immediately after the release of And God Created Woman. Yesterday's ballerina and the wife of a novice director woke up one morning as the most famous woman on the planet. But she didn't yet know that for the right to be called an icon, she would have to surrender her privacy, her safety, and ultimately, her soul. By the late 50s, the name Brigitte Bardot no longer belonged to her. The term BB was born, an abbreviation understood anywhere in the world without translation. It wasn't just admiration. It was the first historical example of mass female imitation. Millions of women began copying her messy, choucroute hairstyle and the way she lined her eyes with black coal. But behind this facade lay terrifying statistics. At her peak, she brought France more profit than the state-owned Renault factories. She was a living export commodity. It was Bardot who became patient zero for what we now call aggressive press stalking. Paparazzi invented methods bordering on insanity. They paid garbage collectors for the right to rummage through her trash, hoping to find used lipstick tubes or cigarette butts with her traces. Every tiny detail could be a sensation. When she stepped outside, it wasn't a crowd of fans waiting for her, but a pack of predators. People acted like savages. Women tried to prick her with pins to see a star's blood, and men tore out clumps of her hair, scalp and all, for souvenirs. Brigitte often recalled how during a trip to London, a mob literally crushed her car and she had to flee through back entrances, choking with panic. Her only refuge was the Villa La Madrague, but even there, peace was an illusion. Photographers rented neighboring houses to watch her garden for days through powerful telephoto lenses. They used helicopters that circled over her head so low that the engine noise drowned out her own thoughts. Brigitte's freedom ended where her fence began. Once, a photographer dressed as a waiter and snuck into her bedroom while she slept to take a photo of the tired star. After that incident, Brigitte began sleeping with a loaded pistol under her pillow. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Brigitte began to hate her face. For her, it wasn't a gift of nature, but a target for hunters. "My beauty is a curse that robbed me of the chance to simply walk down the street and eat ice cream," she wrote in her diaries. She began to suffer from agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces. Daylight made her nauseous because it meant she could be seen. She lived in semi-darkness, behind thick curtains, even in the hottest Saint-Tropez noon. Nervous breakdowns followed one after another. On film sets, she would suddenly go quiet and start weeping, unable to bear the studio lights that reminded her of paparazzi flashes. It was during this period that the deep melancholy was born, the one that would later lead her to the most terrifying decision of her life. She was the most desired woman in the world, but felt like the loneliest creature in the universe. The madness of the streets, the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi, and the loss of her private identity were only the external layers of Brigitte's hell. As we transition from the public witch hunt of the late 50s, we enter the most claustrophobic and controversial period of her life. You see, Brigitte had spent years trying to escape the prison of her parents' home and then the prison of her own fame. But in 1959, she found herself trapped in a prison she couldn't run away from, her own body. This is where the golden myth of Brigitte Bardot officially shatters, revealing a darkness that most of her fans were never ready to face. At 25, Brigitte was at the absolute zenith of her power. She was the woman every man wanted and every woman imitated. But behind the closed doors of her marriage to her second husband, Jacques Charrier, a new drama was brewing. When Brigitte discovered she was pregnant, she didn't react with the joy of a mother-to-be. She reacted with pure, unadulterated horror. To her, pregnancy wasn't a miracle. It was a biological invasion. In her world, her body was her only weapon, her only currency. And now that weapon was being deformed from the inside out. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a miracle. She saw a parasite. In her later memoirs, which would eventually lead to massive lawsuits, she wrote the infamous lines that horrified the world. "I looked at my belly and saw a tumor feeding on my flesh. I was waiting for the moment when I would finally be rid of it." For 9 months, Brigitte became a prisoner in her own home. She couldn't go out because the paparazzi were waiting like vultures to photograph the bloated Bardot. She spent her days in darkened rooms, pacing like a caged animal. The psychological toll was immense. She attempted to self-terminate the pregnancy through violent means, punching her own abdomen and begging doctors for procedures that were illegal at the time. She was a woman at war with her own biology. Her husband, Jacques, tried to control her, which only fueled her resentment. The sweet Brigitte the world saw on movie posters was gone. In her place was a woman screaming in the dark, hating the life growing inside her because it represented the ultimate loss of her youth, the very thing her entire career was built upon. The birth itself was a scene from a thriller. Because the press had surrounded every hospital in Paris, Brigitte was forced to give birth in her private apartment. Imagine the scene. The most famous woman in the world, screaming in agony in her living room, while doctors snuck in through back alleys disguised as delivery men. Outside the window, hundreds of photographers were trying to climb the walls just to hear the first cry of the baby. When Nicholas was born on January 11, 1960, there was no Madonna and child moment. Brigitte refused to nurse him. She refused to hold him. She looked at the newborn and felt nothing but an icy detachment. She famously said, "I felt like a wounded animal that had finally been relieved of its pain." The world wanted a fairy tale, but Brigitte gave them a cold, hard reality that the public would never truly forgive. The dirt of this story deepens as the years go by. Brigitte simply couldn't play the role of a mother. To her, Nicholas was a constant reminder of the trauma of her pregnancy and the end of her freedom. Eventually, she made a choice that remains the biggest stain on her legacy. She handed the boy over to the Charrier family to be raised by his father. She walked away. She chose her career, her animals, and her fleeting romances over her own flesh and blood. She claimed she was too broken to care for another soul when she couldn't even care for herself. This abandonment created a rift that would last for over 60 years. Decades later, when Brigitte published her raw, unfiltered biography, the ghosts of the past returned. Her son, Nicholas, now a man with his own family, sued his own mother for violating his privacy and for the cruel descriptions she wrote about his birth. He won the lawsuit, and Brigitte was forced to pay significant damages. But the money was nothing compared to the emotional silence. Until her death on December 28, 2025, the relationship remained a wasteland. Nicholas lived in Norway, far from the spotlight of Saint-Tropez, and they rarely spoke. Brigitte ended her life surrounded by dogs and cats, perhaps because they were the only creatures that never demanded she be a mother. As we close this chapter, we see a woman who has successfully pushed everyone away. She has survived the paparazzi, she has survived a marriage she hated, and she has survived the child she never wanted. But the cost was her soul. Brigitte Bardot was now free, but she was also becoming a pariah. Ahead of us lie 3 more blocks of this tragedy: her desperate search for a love that didn't exist, her sudden social death at the age of 39, and finally, the quiet, lonely end of a legend who outlived her own myth. Having shed the burden of motherhood, Brigitte threw herself into a whirlpool of passion with redoubled force. She sought a man who could protect her from the world, but each time she chose someone who became her new jailer. Her affair with Jean-Louis Trintignant began as an adultery and ended as a tragedy. On set, under the watchful eye of her first husband Vadim, she fell in love for real. It was the dirty sensation of the time. Trintignant was married, Brigitte was married. They destroyed 2 families in a matter of weeks. But Jean-Louis couldn't handle her fame. He left for military service, and Bardot, unable to be alone, immediately found a replacement. The most vivid and insane episode was her marriage to German billionaire Günter Sachs. It was a battle of 2 egos. Sachs decided to conquer her the way one conquers a fortress. He hired a helicopter and showered her La Madrague estate with thousands of red roses. It looked like a fairy tale, but reality was soaked in cynicism. They married weeks after meeting, and a month later they began to hate each other. Sachs continued his playboy lifestyle, and Brigitte retaliated with open affairs. Their marriage became a competition: who could spend more money and who could humiliate the other more in the press. These were years of luxury hiding total emptiness. We cannot forget Serge Gainsbourg. Their affair lasted only 3 months, but it was the most filthy and explicit. Together, they recorded Je t'aime, moi non plus, a song filled with Brigitte's moans. When Günter Sachs found out, he threatened to sue. Brigitte got scared and begged Serge not to release the recording. She betrayed his feelings for the sake of her social status. Gainsbourg was crushed, and Brigitte realized once again that for her, love was just a temporary drug. 4 official husbands, hundreds of lovers, from aristocrats to waiters. By the end of the 60s, Brigitte became a symbol of disillusionment. Men wanted to possess BB, but no one wanted to deal with the real broken woman. She sought salvation in embraces, but found only more camera flashes and more legal bills. This chaos led her to a logical finale, a total rejection of humanity, which we will discuss in the next block. By the early 70s, Brigitte Bardot was exhausted. Endless lawsuits, betrayals by husbands, and the terror of the press had turned her life into a scorched desert. She felt that the world only loved her for her youth, and this cult of beauty had become her death sentence. Brigitte had a chilling tradition. Instead of celebrations, her birthdays turned into acts of self-destruction. She was terrified of every new digit in her passport. The most terrifying episode occurred when she turned 26. While the whole world was congratulating the icon, she locked herself in a room and tried to fall asleep forever. She was found at the very last moment. She repeated this again and again. To her, aging was equivalent to public humiliation. She didn't want the paparazzi to capture her fading. She wanted to remain eternally young in memory, even if the price was death. In 1973, an event occurred that shocked the industry. At the height of her form, at the age of 39, Brigitte Bardot announced her retirement from cinema forever. This wasn't a graceful exit with a farewell tour. On the set of her last film, she simply looked in the mirror, saw the features of a grown woman, and realized the game was over. She abandoned the unfinished film and drove to her villa. She uttered a phrase that became her manifesto. "I gave my youth and beauty to men. Now I will give my wisdom and experience to animals." She literally killed the actress within herself to save what was left of the human being. Her life at the Villa La Madrague turned into a voluntary exile. She stopped using makeup, stopped following fashion, and forbade any newspapers from being brought into the house. Instead of socialites, she began to be surrounded by hundreds of stray dogs, cats, donkeys, and goats. She spent millions on their upkeep, selling her jewelry and haute couture outfits. Many considered this madness. Neighbors complained about the smell and noise, but Brigitte didn't care. She found in animals what humans never gave her: unconditional loyalty that didn't need her photo shoots or her money. The years passed, and Bardot transformed into the ghost of Saint-Tropez. She limped due to arthritis, refusing surgeries because she didn't trust doctors. She lived in semi-darkness, rarely stepping beyond the limits of her garden. She consciously chose the path of ugly aging as an opposition to her golden youth. It was her final protest against the world that once wanted to buy her. But ahead lay her quietest and saddest finale in December 2025. Decades passed. The world changed. New stars were born and faded, but at the La Madrague villa, time seemed to stand still. Brigitte Bardot, once the loudest woman on the planet, had turned into its deepest silence. In her final years, she rarely left her room. She lived surrounded by the ghosts of the past and her loyal animals. She refused plastic surgeries, proudly wearing every wrinkle like a scar from her battle with the world. "I don't want to be a beautiful old woman. I just want to be myself," she would say. She watched her former husbands, her friends, her era die off. She remained the last of the greats, locked in the scenery of her vanishing youth. Winter in Saint-Tropez was always quiet, but the morning of December 28, 2025, felt especially cold. At the age of 91, Brigitte Bardot's heart finally stopped. She went exactly as she had dreamed, in her own bed, to the sound of the sea, surrounded not by camera flashes, but by the warmth of her dogs. There were no doctors, no fake condolences, no battles over inheritance in her final moments. Only her and eternity. The news of her death spread instantly. Paris fell into mourning. But it wasn't just grief for an actress. It was the funeral of an entire era. With Bardot's passing, the book on the golden age of cinema and European freedom was finally closed. She was the last one who remembered what it was like to be truly free while the whole world watched. She was the one who wasn't afraid to grow old in a world that worships only youth. Today, there is silence at La Madrague. The dogs are still waiting for their mistress, and the sea continues to crash against the shore of Saint-Tropez. Brigitte Bardot is gone, but her sin, her beauty, and her drama remain forever in the DNA of history. She proved that you can be the most desired woman in the world and yet remain the loneliest person, staying true to yourself until your very last breath. Thank you for watching Old Hollywood Story. Remember her as she was, wild, free, and forever young. Goodbye, Brigitte.